We begin with a near total media blackout in Africa's third largest country, Sudan, and the protests there that threaten to undo 30 years of one-man rule, that of President Omar al-Bashir. The demands of those taking to the streets are straightforward: the end of the regime. And Bashir's response, the jailing of protesters, clamping down on journalism, evokes echoes of the Arab Spring. The day after demonstrations began 2 months ago, the government shut down access to social media platforms. Despite that, Twitter and WhatsApp are still the main stages for Sudan's information war. The Bashir government has also ordered that printing presses not publish newspapers covering the protests. And it's open season on journalists. 70 have been arrested. Half a dozen foreign correspondents, including some from this network, have had their credentials revoked. Governments facing challenges to their authority have an array of weapons at their disposal, and President al-Bashir is using just about all of them. Our starting point this week is Khartoum. President Omar al-Bashir has a message for would-be revolutionaries working online in Sudan. تغيير الحكومة وتغيير الرئيس ما بتم بالواتساب ولا بالفيسبوك يتم بصندوق. Or wait, if Bashir had not first taken power through a military coup almost 30 years ago, or if Sudan's last elections, held almost 9 years ago, met international standards for fairness, which they did not.
The president's speech proved how worried he is. What he is saying stems from fear only, nothing else. When a young person holds a phone in Sudan's streets, he is posing the greatest threat to the regime because he's documenting its crimes. There are more than 9 million internet users in the country. 90% of citizens have mobile phones. What we're seeing happening now in Sudan is all through social media, and it's proved very successful.
What is happening on the streets now is more than mere demonstrations and protests. This is a revolution in the true sense of the word. You can see signs of a shift, a switch in people's ways of thinking, a demand for actual change. What the Sudanese people are calling for is similar, in a big way, to what people called for during the Arab Spring.
But there is also a uniqueness, a point of distinction in that our experiences are coming several years after the Arab Spring, and therefore we have learned from the mistakes made during those revolutions.
As have the governments involved, and therein lies the rub. The protests began in mid-December in the north of Sudan. They were set off by the rising cost of bread and fuel, but quickly grew into a movement with more fundamental demands, changes, more political freedoms, an end to al-Bashir's rule. By the time the protests reached the capital, Khartoum, the government was armed for an information war. Domestic media outlets were ordered were blocked. The clampdown has not stopped activists from getting the pictures out. The security services beating protesters, in some cases shooting them, or running them over. VPNs, virtual private networks, have allowed activists to circumvent the shutdown. It's the technology of choice in countries where the authorities cut off access to online sites, since VPNs allow users to move beyond the control of any government.
You see a lot on Twitter, photos and sharing through WhatsApp, and the government just doesn't have any control over that, except for trying at times to interrupt and slow down the internet. But that also, I mean, at the end hasn't really worked. People have found alternative ways to spread that information. Hashtags like #JustFall have become very popular. This has just been an incredible way to share information.
We work to document everything: the regime's crimes and violations, wounded, the martyrs, as many details as possible. In our videos and pictures, it is very clear who is committing the crime, so the existence of social media acts as a very major deterrent.
Then you have these pro-government trolls that try to influence how news is perceived. In Sudan, they're called, nicknamed Al-Jidad al-Electroni, or which can be translated as electronic chickens, which is a playoff of the word jihad.
They're injected in so many different WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups. Most of them are in Sudan, but also they were from outside the country. You see them always arguing, issuing statements, trying to push people not to be supportive to the idea of demonstrating against the regime.
The framing of the demonstrations on television, when they are covered by state-owned channels Sudan TV and Khartoum TV, as well as the privately owned S24, is decidedly pro-government. The channels paraded student protesters from Darfur in front of the cameras, where they were forced to confess their ties to a rebel group, the Sudan Liberation Army.
أنا شايل طبنجة واطلع المظاهرة في أثناء المظاهرة بقوم بضرب المواطنين لازم تقول للحكومة قتلتهم.
It had all the elements of a show trial made for television. We contacted officials at the Sudanese Ministry of Information to request an interview. They declined to speak with us. The government has banned newspapers from covering the protests. The intelligence service, the NISS, raided the offices of Al Jarida last month. The paper has not published a print edition since, operating online only. Others, like Al Tayar, now publish blank spaces where protest coverage and opinion columns would not. The censorship comes in many forms and at various stages of the publication process.
They call each chief editor to the security forces offices and they give them warning and they give names. This particular name, if he wrote in your newspaper, we are going to punish you. Before they send their papers to printing, there is a security officer. There is anything against the regime.
Then there is confiscation after publishing. In this case, the entire issue of the paper, or the copies, will be taken immediately after printing. This is, of course, a double punishment, since the newspaper still pays the printing press, even though no copies of the paper have been sold.
If I look at my work over the last 2 months, no more than 5 of my articles have been published. The red lines are decided by the security services, so speaking negatively about the security service is unacceptable. Talk of the army isn't acceptable either. An intelligence officer told me I had to stop writing about President Bashir. Now, after the huge increase in demonstrations, all the red lines have merged into one red line, and that is the street.
I'm a Sudanese journalist.
The harassment of journalists in Sudan is not limited to the domestic media. No foreign correspondent there has it easy these days, which is why international coverage of the story has been lacking. However, correspondents from Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya have it worse. Their credentials have been revoked. It's clear the Bashir government fears pan-Arab news broadcasters more than other international outlets, because those channels are telling this story in the language of the Sudanese street, Arabic.
And that's why you see Al-Arabiya, Al-Hadath, Al Jazeera, particularly their videographers being harassed, being intimidated, even being assaulted. Not so much with print, especially English print, but definitely video and photography, and especially in Arabic, because it seemed that the government was fearful of the kind of news coverage that would have an impact on the street.
The red lines being imposed by the Sudanese government are in line with the words of the pharaohs. I will only show you what I see. The government does not want the people to see anything other than what it deems permissible. Therefore, if the drawing of red lines is left to the government, they would encompass everything. There would be no limits.